Sustainability can often seem like a depressing catalog of doom and gloom. But although we face serious challenges, a better and more sustainable future is possible. Welcome to Sustainable Planet. I'm political scientist Michael Baranowski. My co-host and spouse is political scientist Kimberly Weir. Today we're going to be talking about consumption and consumerism. And I thought it made sense for us to start with something I'm betting most people are familiar with. Those 3 R's of sustainability: reduce, reuse, and recycle. Although I learned from Kimberly just a little bit ago that actually there are more than 3 R's, right?
That's right. And the most important definitely is the reduce. And it took a while for that to change from just the focus on recycle. But in addition to reduce and reuse and recycle, we've got now repair, especially the right to repair is something that's been especially the most recent elections in November. It was on the ballots. To push for a right to repair. Repurpose is another. Reinvent now is even come into use.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be a traditionalist on this, and I'm sticking with 3 R's. I think this proliferation of R's is in and of itself unsustainable. But anyway, no matter whether it's 3 R's or 5 R's or 37 R's, I don't care. I think the most important R, I would argue, is the one that's first. It's first for a reason, and that's reduce. And I'm betting, I don't know. Do you agree with me on that, Kimberly?
Oh, absolutely so. And that the fact that a lot of people don't think of the reduce first, but recycle is something that has been sort of inculcated into us that, oh, well, we can have single-use disposable items, plastic bottles, we can have plastic bags, things like that, yogurt, single-use yogurt containers, and these things for our convenience. And hey, it's easy to deal with because then we can just recycle it.
Right. But I think obviously if we're concerned about depleting resources, which is what sustainability is about, not about depleting them, but about depleting them less rapidly, I guess, reducing makes the most sense. It's the most direct way to have an effect, arguably. Not arguably, it actually is the case. And so that's why we're starting with consumption, looking at how much we consume, what's being done to maybe help people, to incentivize people to consume less, and what you can do. And so starting with the fact that, well, we are consuming a whole lot more. Now, I'm the more quantitatively oriented of the two of us. And so I want to start by putting out what I think are some very telling numbers on consumption in the world. I'll start with the U.S. because that's what I know best. In 1959, it's 65 years ago, total personal consumption expenditure, it's usually abbreviated or acronymized as PCE, for the U.S. was $306.1 billion. That's roughly $3.25 trillion in 2024 dollars. PCE in December of 2023, it's the most recent data that's available, is just over 19 trillion. And so what that means is even accounting for inflation, in the U.S., we're spending over 5.8 times more on stuff than we did 65 years ago. And if you take a look at the world in general, the numbers are even more staggering. In 1970, world consumer spending was 1.75 trillion, and that's in constant dollars adjusted for inflation. In 2023, 53.1 trillion. That's right, 53.1. In other words, over 30 times more. That's just mind-boggling, I think. And I got to say, I always thought of us here in the U.S. as like the world's greatest consumers. But when I looked at this data, it was clear to me that while we Americans are consuming a whole lot more, we're really pikers compared to this worldwide increase. Kimberly, you're an international person. How do you account for, why do you think it is that overall world increase in consumerism is way more than the not at all unsizable U.S. increase?
Well, There are a few things going on. One, I mean, if we look at the United States versus China, for example, China's got 1 billion people and it's still an emerging economy. So there's a lot of growth that needs to happen, especially in rural areas of China. And so that the fact that the United States is consuming about $19 trillion equivalent of consumer goods, compare that to 53 trillion for the world. And you look at the population of the United States, which is 350 million people versus 1 billion in China. That to you doesn't look, you explain that as the United States looks like that's insignificant, but in fact, that's a lot for a small number of people.
We do our best. I'd like to think. So, but I guess your point is that when you're going from, I don't know, your 2,000-foot square home to your 2,500 square foot home, that's going to be less than going from a hut somewhere in a rural place to actually some sort of basic accommodation. There's just a lot more, not only just room for growth, but actually need for growth in a lot of these developing, emerging economies, right?
For certain. I mean, there are people who don't have refrigerators, for example, who would really benefit from being able to preserve food in the way we do in the United States, whereas we have two fridges and a freezer, right? That's not uncommon for people to have multiple full-size refrigerator freezers in their houses.
And so I think everyone will accept the fact that, yes, there is a lot more consumption. And then the question becomes, well, why? And again, I think the answer for this is different when you're looking at developing countries and the developed world. And as we talked about, in developing countries, a lot of it is just to get to some sort of basic standard of living where you have decent, safe housing and medical care and basic services, that sort of thing. But the reasons are a lot different in the West, in the developed, the rich countries, right? And that gets, I guess, into a distinction that I want to make between what I would call sort of reasonable consumption and over or conspicuous consumption. And I know you've thought a lot about this sort of thing.
Sure. That's, spend way too much time thinking about these things, I'm sure. I think that when it comes to looking at the world and development, that we look at the 194 sovereign countries in the world, and of those, 32 of them qualify as global north developed status. So that means that there are 162 other countries in the world that still would really benefit from qualitative improvement in their standard of living. And so, yeah, there's a lot of growth that needs to happen, and that's not where the growth is happening. And I think you're dead on when you say there's a difference between consumption and consumption that would actually improve the quality of someone's life, as opposed to overconsumption, which is what we tend to see a lot more in the West, global North, rich, however we're going to describe these countries. My go-to term is global North. That's just, I'm conditioned as an international relations person to distinguish global North from global South, and the in between are the emerging economies like China, Russia, South Africa, Brazil, and so forth. Countries where they're at a higher level of development, have a much larger growing middle class. And so for the global North, we see a lot of overconsumption, and not even just overconsumption, but encouraging overconsumption.
And that sounds like there's a judgment here, right? I mean, the way you say overconsumption, and I mean, I'm certainly more guilty of this than you are, but I think there's a couple things driving this, right? And this idea certainly of advertising, just us being inundated with it in a way that we never have in the past, and targeted advertising. And everyone who's listening to this is going to be intimately familiar with this sort of thing, right? And that capitalism as a system is essentially designed to function by, or needs to function through getting us to buy more and more and more.
Absolutely. I mean, it starts with the American dream, right, in the United States. And then we see that as people achieved economic security after living through the Depression and World War II and going through rationing and so forth, and not having their basic material needs securely met, right? That expectation that, months from now, years from now, that they're going to have that security, they were a lot more conservative in terms of their spending and their use of products and reusing. Like people like your mother, right, would reuse aluminum foil. And Michael picks on me all the time. Well, doesn't anymore, but when I started reusing and rewashing Ziploc bags, because they're intended for single use, but the reality is you can reuse them many times. And so we have just become accustomed to everything just being disposable. And another big important factor, I think, is disposable income. We have more increased disposable income, but we also have this coincides with the increase of available consumer credit, and credit cards and credit lines are just an ecological nightmare for two reasons. On the one hand, most credit cards are made from PVC plastic, which is not recyclable. And the Economic Times of India, for example, estimates that in 2024, there are currently about 20 billion credit cards in circulation worldwide. And that will amount to 400 million tons of plastic waste. On the other hand, then, we've got that these credit cards encourage overconsumption. Right? Think about how difficult it is if you have to, especially for older people like us, right? The difficulty of actually having the thought of paying cash for something as opposed to just swiping a plastic credit card. Like you go out and you buy a car. Can you imagine just like taking a pile of cash to do that? That would be painful, utterly painful. But you swipe your your credit card and you're good. There, you got your car, right?
Which is why I think household debt, according to the most recent figures, at least in the U.S., is something like $17.5 trillion, which is just a staggering number. But again, and I think the important thing to me, at least, is that the imperatives, the incentives of the system are to disassociate those things and to make it as easy as possible to spend and buy and consume more, which is why I think when we think about this in terms of sustainability, we're dealing with a lot of problems, because when the fundamental structures of our system incentivize so strongly and regularly to do these things, it's really a thorny problem. And you can't just, government policy can't just get ahead of what people are willing to do, especially not in capitalist democracies where, we don't have authoritarian governments. Some people might differ, but and so I think that there are, though, I think some things that governments can and have done. For instance, I hate this phrase, but I'll use it: raising awareness. And that's I'm rolling my eyes. You can't see me, but I think the idea is important. It's that helping people to understand, or at least to get them to think about how almost unconsciously and mindlessly we do these things, like throwing away plastic bags or Ziploc bags, the example you gave, that sort of thing. And to try to get people not to guilt them in or to kind of virtue signal, but to essentially get them to think, well, hey, could you use this again? And I think there are ways to raise awareness in a way that doesn't make people feel bad about what they're currently doing, because I think that's sort of self-defeating.
I agree. I think back to the tracking logs that I would have my students do for the politics of food or sustainability. And the most recent time I taught the class, one of my students, one of the things I had them track was single-use plastic products. And one of the students actually admitted then that she started washing her Ziploc bags for her snack bag that she was bringing to school, because she didn't want to have to write that down as something that she disposed of. And then, it turned into something that she ended up continuing to do after that. And it made me think of me with all of the, Ziploc bags staying on the refrigerator, all of the Ziploc bags that I pinned to the refrigerator with the
magnets. Yeah.
Magnets, right? Because it's, I can't now, in good conscience, I can't just put that in, oh my gosh, I can't even put it in a garbage can. Our garage is a veritable like recycle center waiting to put stuff in the proper places and bins and deliver them to the proper places, because I can't just throw that away now, knowing what I know about the extended potential lifespan. And
I also think it's important to try to link this to visible, tangible things. And so when people, I think a lot of people hear forecasts about the 2030, by 2050, that sort of thing, climate change. Well, that doesn't feel as real as, say, seeing going to a waste management facility, going to the dump, as it were. And I know you've taken your students to see those facilities. And it really gives you, I think, an appreciation in a visceral sort of way of all the stuff that we're throwing away and the difficulties of finding places for it. And I think people need to connect to that when they just see these sort of disembodied far future forecasts. It's harder for them to get a real sense of these things.
Well, not only that, but it's also very overwhelming. It's overwhelming for me, someone who's really aware of these things and aware of the places where things can be recycled or where they can be donated to be, instead of going into a landfill, the electronics can go and they can be recycled electronically, electronic recycling and so forth, instead of just becoming electronic waste. And I think this ties into, as you're talking about, policies that the government can and should do more to help out people, because capitalism needs us to buy more stuff. And because corporations for a long time have been really pushing us to do this. This starts in the 1920s when people had a little bit more disposable income. And then it breaks off with, it decreases with the Great Depression and World War II. But then after that, with the post-World War II boom, I wasn't even aware of the fact that planned obsolescence was a term that actually came into use in the 1950s, along with functional obsolescence, which is products that wear out quickly, and psychological obsolescence, which are products designed to become obsolete in the mind of the consumer, even sooner than the components used to make them will fail. These are terms that were around in the post-war boom. And now planned obsolescence has really reemerged as a concept that has become more of a buzzword of late. And I think that that's tied to the fact that, especially with technological devices like phones and so forth, that it's the software upgrades. It's either they don't support the security software upgrade, so you're forced to buy a new phone like I was very recently, or loading so much garbage onto the system that it just bogs it down. And in fact, the country of Italy filed a lawsuit against Apple some years ago to force them to stop bogging down people's systems. And Italy won, and Apple was forced to change their policy there.
And I think oftentimes of the focus that we have on sustainability and climate change and environmentalism has to do with things like green technology. For instance, it was a big deal was made of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. in 2022. And it was a big deal. It was like $370 billion or so in climate-related provisions, like things like clean energy production, electric vehicles, loan guarantees for clean tech, and all of this stuff. But the point being is that was focusing not on helping people to consume less, but letting them consume at the same rate in a way that is more sustainable. And that's only, I would argue, and now the techno-optimists, the true techno-optimists would disagree with me. I would argue that's an important part of the solution, but it's only part of it. And it's hard for me to envision the consumption levels that we are currently at in the rich countries in the world, the rest of the world coming up to that, even with great technology, and it not being just a sustainability nightmare.
Right, because what needs to happen and what's not happening is that people actually need to change their behavior. Yeah, that's really hard. Yeah. That's a hard ask, right? It's really hard to ask somebody to do that. And so that's part of that's the underlying problem. And so it's like it's always the Band-Aid solution. Wow, we've got this this environmental problem, so let's slap a Band-Aid on it and hope that it's just going to go away. And that's not going to happen. As you point out, Michael, it's just going to continue to get worse because we need to have actual changes. And these policies aren't curbing behavior. They're just basically endorsing that behavior.
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead, keep buying more stuff. And it's the term is called the halo effect, right? Because it makes you feel like you're doing good because, oh yeah, now I have a place to have this recycled. Well, recycling is expensive. And the only stuff that can be recycled is stuff that in the community a person lives in has a place that can process that stuff and also has an aftermarket for it, because they have to have an economic incentive to take those goods, to take those bottles or bags. If they don't have an aftermarket for that, they're going into a landfill.
Yeah, and we're going to get into, in a future episode, a lot about recycling. What you think you might know about recycling, I'm betting that a lot of it is, if not wrong, at least somewhat misinformed. I know my eyes were opened a lot when I looked into that. But I do want to point out that there are things governments can do and have done to actually influence behavior. There's an old saying, if you want less of something, tax it. And tax policy is an incredibly powerful tool to affect behavior in all sorts of ways, because it works in reverse too. If you want more of something, well, then you give individuals and businesses a tax incentive to do it. And so, for instance, there have been a number of countries that have actually taxed carbon emissions, which arguably the most important single sort of tax that a lot of people can think of in terms of climate change. And I'm not talking about just some random little countries. This list, France, the UK, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Portugal, Ireland, Mexico, a bunch of countries. And in fact, this was an idea in the United States. It gained a certain amount of interest, and it actually started on the right in the 80s, sort of as a response to the environmental movement that was largely a progressive left thing in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, because people on the right said, well, why don't we use market mechanisms to do this sort of thing? And a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, something like that, is much better, they thought, than a very regulatory sort of heavy approach with the big hand of government sort of thing. But in the U.S., it never really had the political backing to become law, but it has in a number of other countries. And I would argue that certainly is one approach that, while politically is a non-starter right now in the U.S., is definitely something that I think is a positive development in a lot of other countries.
Absolutely. Though, think about how big the United States is and how small most other European countries and those that you named are. They have to deal with waste. They have to deal with these issues. They're low-lying countries that are dealing with rising water levels. They're countries that don't have a lot of places to put landfills, to build landfills. They just don't have the land to do this. These are countries like the Netherlands that are dealing with losing actual territory because of creeping up water lines and so forth, and flooding. And so most countries that are enacting these policies have a much more pressing and immediate reason to do this. Whereas the United States, I always kind of feel like we can just retreat inland. Yeah, well, we might lose California, but that's okay, right? Because we've got all this land. They just keep moving inward, and they'll still have the beach because, it'll all be flooded, whatever. So, but my point being is that the big countries like the United States have less of an incentive to do this. And we see oftentimes the United States, instead of actually dealing with these issues in meaningful ways, instead, they're giving subsidies to continue bad behavior in some cases, like grow this stuff that we're just going to we don't need more corn. We'll make ethanol out of it.
Yeah. And I think in the U.S. especially, there's a political culture difference for a lot of those countries I mentioned, and that is there is much more of a individual liberty sort of thing, even less trust in government, less belief that government's going to do the right thing with tax dollars and so forth. And and again, this is maybe where reframing comes in, and where I think that maybe more market-focused mechanisms have a better chance in the U.S. because there's a concept in economics about called externalities, where there are costs actually to certain transactions, certain sort of things that aren't borne at that moment by the buyer or the seller, but are going to be that future generations, that other parties are going to have to pick up the tab for. And that's exactly the issue that we have with these things that contribute to climate change. And so if there's a way to reframe this as well, the bill's got to come due sometime. Do we want to do the responsible thing and pay for it now? Or do we want to have future generations, our kids, would have you pay for it in the future? I think that's a way to frame that in such a way that makes it at least somewhat more palatable for people who kind of have that much more of a liberty sort of orientation, to frame it in terms of responsibility as opposed to kind of, well, big government's going to take all your money.
I'm not sure exactly how this fits in, but I know that it does. I was really surprised that in Ohio, we just ended up having to get a new car. And so we did. And in Ohio, to make up for the loss in gasoline taxes, owners of hybrid and electric cars pay an annual fee of $100. And so this is an interesting sort of consumption tax that the state now is missing out on as people move away from gasoline. And so the state and the county and whatever, they need this money, right? But at the same time, this punishes people who are actually making a good environmental choice in their vehicle.
And I got to say, Kimberly was hot about this when really pissed. So, yeah.
And I generally don't have a problem with taxes and taxation. I think taxes are really important. But when I saw this, I was like, this goes completely against the grain when it comes to what we should be doing and encouraging people to do for environmental reasons.
And maybe we can shift into that, because I want to make sure we talk about this as well. Moving away from government and thinking about what individuals can do. And to me, again, I'm going to come back to reframing, because I think as long as people associate consuming less with being less well off, having a lower standard of living, you're kind of fighting a losing battle. And so I think a couple ways to people can reframe is to look at things in terms of, well, saving for the future, saving for their children, or greater economic security. In fact, there's a whole movement on that called the FIRE movement, stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early. And it really is, when you read a lot of their documents, literature, and Kimberly, she's a big fan of this one guy, Mr. Money Mustache. I like him too. He's a big FIRE guy. But it really is about living sustainably, but framed in an entirely different way. It's framed in terms of having freedom. And I think that's a much more appealing kind of, don't have to just have one set of clothes and live in a yurt somewhere sort of thing, but actually this gives me options. This protects me in case of any kind of calamities or things like that. And I think that's a very powerful sort of tool for people.
I think it's also a very self-interested reason to make these choices, instead of, for example, with plastic bag bans, right? Oh, well, now I don't get a plastic bag, or I have to pay for it at the store. And people get their hype up about that. But if you think about it in the reverse way, which is, I have a good incentive to do this. And this is something that then I don't have to pay for. I save more money. Didn't work out well.
No, I know exactly what you mean. I think, again, another thing that I tried a few years ago, actually, that was really interesting, is trying to calculate, even roughly, how much every purchase I made, what that equated to, and how much I would have to work. Because the process of buying stuff is so frictionless. I mean, I have this love-hate relationship with Amazon, right? One click, everything. And when you stop just for a second to say, like, okay, if I buy this thing, that equates to 3 hours of work or 4 hours of work. And that really changes, I think, your perspective on a lot of these things. And so I would encourage people to do whatever you can to sort of just reframe that in a way, because as long as you think well, I'm depriving myself of something by not getting this. You might white knuckle your way through that for a while, but it's just going to feel awful, and that's not sustainable. So it has to be more along the lines of what I am giving myself by not buying this thing or by reusing this thing. That's a far more powerful incentive than just continually depriving yourself throughout your life. That's awful. No one wants to do that. Well, there are some people, but they're weird.
But that's really difficult because people are at every single turn just inundated with, I mean, if you're looking at your phone, if you're looking at your iPad or your tablet, there are just advertisements everywhere you turn. You can't even sit down and watch a show or a movie without product placement, right? You can't drive down the road without billboards, not even just permanent billboards anymore, but billboards that are regularly changing. Every time we turn around, we're getting that message of you need more, buy more. How are you going to keep up with your neighbors? You don't have a McMansion. So now you need a bigger house because you're not going to be as cool as the other people if you don't have a bowling alley in your basement, whatever, you know?
Yeah. But I think, again, this comes back to this idea of low-hanging fruit, where it's easy to feel like, well, I can't do all this stuff and it's overwhelming. And so I'm just going to forget about it. But even if you can do a few little things, you'd be amazed. I am so much more of a consumer than Kimberly is. Like, way more. She's kind of my role model on this. I try to remind myself that even if I can just, for instance, when we're watching TV at night, if I just put the mute button on for the commercials, it's hard because I want to hear about all this cool stuff. But I'm weak. She's much stronger than I'm weak, and I want stuff and I see stuff, and so I feel so much better when I can just not have that temptation. It's, I'm kind of like the person with the drinking problem. Well, you don't go into a bar, right? And that's a big part of it for me. If I can just remove myself from some of that temptation, it really does make a difference. And so there are all kinds of things that I don't know about, that I don't desire, that I don't purchase because I do that little thing. And it's a super simple thing to do. It's just clicking a button, for 30, 60, whatever, 90 seconds. And so I would encourage everyone, low-hanging fruit, do what you can. You might feel like it's a losing battle, but every little bit you do and that other people do kind of in combination, hey, that really does add up.
And I think that with all of the entirely different sort of aspect of this, all of the studies done about people's happiness, level of happiness and so forth, that this is something that you don't seem like a far less happy person because you aren't buying as much stuff as you used to.
I'm actually happier. When I get into that, I mean, there's no question. And so for me, we're past that point where more stuff is more happiness. That curve kind of flattens out. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, the research on that is, I think, fairly clear. So, yeah.
And that goes.
Go ahead.
Well, that goes back to what you said at the beginning with consumption being $19 trillion in the United States. And then a little bit later, you said that, but at the same time, there's $17 trillion of debt in the United States. And so really, in reality, there's only $2 trillion of spending that's going on that doesn't bog people down with debt.
Yeah. And that gets into the whole FIRE movement and that, well, what are you getting for this $200,000, $300,000, $500,000 you're spending? Well, you're getting that thing, but you're also getting the anxiety that comes along with it and all that, with the debt and all that. So, when we've been looking around at houses, thinking about potentially moving, and it seems like everything is all about, well, let's start from how much the absolute top end of what you can afford. And let's go with that. It was the same thing when we were looking for a new vehicle. So how much of a payment can you absolutely afford? And that's what we'll go with. That's a horrible starting place if you want your life to be less anxious about financial stuff. And so I would encourage everyone to kind of try to, as much as you can, reframe things in terms of emotional, anxiety and the lack thereof. If you have fewer things to worry about and less debt. And that actually has the great effect, in addition to that, of you feeling better, of it being almost certainly better for sustainability. So if you take care of yourself first in that sense, the sustainability follows. And I think any policy that tells people, hey, take care of yourself first, appeals to their self-interest, that's going to be a lot more powerful than what about the polar bears? So
Agreed.
On that polar bear note, well, maybe I do feel for the polar bears. So
I do too.
Actually, but we'll close on that note. And we would appreciate it if you could rate us and leave a review on whatever podcast app you're listening on. It really helps out. If you've got a question or a comment for us, you can reach us in a bunch of ways. There's email. We're mail@splanetpod.com. And we're also on Instagram, Facebook, and X. And links to all that are in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening.